In the autumn of 1906, on a burned hill in central Anatolia, a dig drove into the ash of a fire 3,000 years cold. And out of that ash came clay tablets, by the 100, then by the 1,000. They were baked rock hard by the same blaze that had gutted the building they were stored in, and written over in a script no one alive could read. Then one tablet was brushed clean and read. It was a peace treaty, and its other half had been carved on the wall of a temple in Egypt, 1,000 miles away, for 3,000 years. The two matched. These were the Hittites, a people most of history remembered only as a line in the Bible, a name the experts had all but written off as barely real. And they had just erupted in their own handwriting out of the ground. A dead language, a matched treaty, an empire the world's experts had filed away as a footnote. All of it coming up out of one hillside at once. To understand how that hill came to hold a superpower, and how the world very nearly lost it forever, you have to go back. 70 years back, to the day a stranger first walked into the city that hill had buried. In 1834, a French traveller named Charles Texier climbed a ridge in the hills of central Anatolia and walked into a dead city the size of a capital. Walls running for miles, 5 great gates, a lion cut into the stone of one of them, staring out at nothing. And on a cliff a short walk away, carved into the living rock, a procession of gods. Dozens of them marching in single file toward a meeting in the center, the same way they had marched for 30 centuries. Texier drew it all, carefully, beautifully. He filled pages, and he had no idea whose city it was, none at all. He guessed eventually at a name from an old Greek history book, a place called Pteria, a city Herodotus mentions once and never explains. The guess was wrong, and it stuck. For something like 70 years, the capital of a vanished empire sat in the open Anatolian air, drawn and published in a 3-volume book, filed under the wrong name. And the whole time, under the same hill Texier was standing on, the empire's own archive lay in the dark, waiting. The tablets that would one day come up out of the ash. Now look at what the wrong name hid. This was not the ruin of some small, forgotten town. 1,500 years before Texier climbed that ridge, this city had been alive. Picture it. Smoke rising off the great temple. Chariots in the lower town, scribes pressing wedge marks into wet clay in a dozen rooms, recording grain and gods and the letters of kings. Soldiers on a rampart that ran for miles over the hills, behind walls thick enough to drive a cart along the top of. A king on a throne up on the high rock, ruling an empire that reached across Anatolia and down into Syria. And this king dealt with Egypt not as a subject, not even as a rival to be feared, but as an equal. He wrote to the pharaoh and called him brother. A superpower, with a capital you could see from the road. So how does that happen? How does a capital that size sit in plain sight for 70 years and stay nameless? Because the world had already decided what it knew, and what it knew was this: the Hittites were a minor tribe from the back pages of the Bible, a walk-on. Abraham buys a burial plot from the children of Heth. A soldier named Uriah the Hittite is sent to die so a king can take his wife. A footnote, not an empire. The name was a curiosity, the kind of thing you read straight past. Now, whether the people the Bible called Hittites are the same as the empire under that hill is a genuinely open question, and a good one. Scholars still argue it, and we can come back to it. But set that argument aside for a moment, because it misses the larger fact. The empire under the hill was real. Whoever the scripture meant, that fortress in the highlands had held a documented great power, and the world had it drawn in a book, named in scripture, and could not read a single word of it. The only people who could read that city were the people who built it, and they had been silent for 3,000 years. So how do you make a dead empire speak? The first man to try was not an archaeologist at all. He was a missionary, and his tool was wet plaster. In December of 1872, in the Syrian town of Hama, a missionary named William Wright did something the local people thought was either useless or mildly insane. Built into the walls of the town were several blocks of old stone, carved over with symbols nobody could read. Strange figures, animals, a script that belonged to no living language. The townspeople had their own use for them. They chipped fragments off to grind up as a cure for fevers and aching eyes. Wright got permission, mixed up wet plaster, and pressed it into the carvings to take casts. Clean copies he could send away to scholars who might know what they were. And he reached a conclusion the professionals were nowhere near ready to accept. He said these carvings were Hittite. The remains of that biblical footnote. Except, he thought, the footnote had been something a great deal bigger. He was modest about it. Years later, when he turned out to be right, he wrote one of the most honest sentences anyone in this whole story ever set down. "I claim no credit," he wrote, "beyond the exercise of a little common sense, for suggesting that the Hama inscriptions were Hittite remains." A little common sense. A man with no standing in the field had read the stones correctly years before the experts caught up. And the thread was thin the whole way. One of the men chasing it was George Smith, the British Museum scholar who had, a few years earlier, stunned the world by reading a Babylonian account of a great flood off a broken clay tablet. He went out to find more of the empire and located one of its great sites in northern Syria. He never came home. He caught fever on the journey and died at Aleppo in 1876 in his mid-30s. That is how the Hittites came back. Not in one clean discovery, but in pieces, carried by a handful of people across decades, some of whom did not live to see it proved. A missionary's plaster, a dead man's notes, an Oxford Don everyone was laughing at. And in Oxford, a scholar named Archibald Sayce had begun gathering up the scattered pieces. Wright's mute Syrian stones, the nameless city in Anatolia, the Bible's stubborn little tribe. He fitted them all into one outrageous claim, that every piece was the wreckage of a single forgotten empire, one that had once stood level with Egypt. His colleagues had a name for him. They called him the inventor of the Hittites. Not the discoverer, the inventor, as in a man making things up. One standard German reference book of the day gave the entire Hittite people 7 lines of text. 7 lines for a superpower. The experts were sure Sayce was chasing a ghost. And the whole argument now came down to a single thing none of them had. The empire's own words, in bulk, in a quantity no one could wave away. Words you could dig up and lay on a table and prove. In 1906, a German dig went looking for exactly that, in the one place no one had thought to look, under Texier's nameless city. His name was Hugo Winkler, and the hill he started digging was Texier's, the nameless ruin still filed under the wrong name. What he hit, almost at once, was the thing the whole argument had been waiting for: a royal archive. Thousands of clay tablets stored in a building that had burned down at the empire's end, and the fire that destroyed the building had done the tablets a favour. It baked the clay hard as brick and preserved every one of them. Around 2,500 tablets came up out of the earth in that first season alone. And then Winkler read one of them. It was a treaty, a peace treaty between the king of this lost city and the pharaoh of Egypt. And Winkler already knew this treaty because its other copy, carved in Egyptian on a temple wall in the south, had been readable and famous for years. Here, in the ash of an Anatolian hill, was the second half. The same agreement written by the other side, 1,000 miles away, in a different language and a different script. And it matched. The nameless city had a name. It was Hattusa, the capital of the Hittites. And Sayce, the man they had mocked as a maker of ghosts, was right. Winkler, by his own account, sat in the dirt with that tablet and felt everything else he had ever done go small. He had pulled a superpower out of the ground and proven it real with its own signature. And Sayce, the inventor of the Hittites, lived to see it and allowed himself one line of vindication. "It is not the biblical writer," he wrote, "but the modern author, who is now proved to have been unacquainted with the contemporaneous history of the time." The men who had been so sure were the ones who had gotten it wrong. The experts had given the Hittites 7 lines in a reference book. Under one hill lay tens of thousands of their own. So who were they, really, now that we can read them? Start with the city itself, because the city is the argument. Hattusa, at its height, covered nearly 2 square kilometers, ringed by something like 6 to 8 kilometers of double stone walls, studded with more than 100 towers. 5 monumental gates, a tunnel driven straight through the base of the rampart, 70 meters of stone-vaulted passage so the defenders could come out behind anyone attacking the wall. A single temple complex covering 14,000 square meters. This was not a town that grew. It was a fortress that was built on purpose, at scale, by a state that could command the labor. And it sat at the center of a world we had completely forgotten existed. In the late Bronze Age, a handful of great powers ran the Near East between them: Egypt, Babylon, the Kingdom of Assyria, the Kingdom of Mitanni, and Hatti. They ran a kind of club. They wrote to each other constantly. They traded gold and complaints and daughters. And in their letters, king to king, they used one particular word for one another: brother. My brother, the Pharaoh of Egypt, writes to the king of the Hittites, and means it as a statement of rank. You and I are the same kind of thing. There are only a few of us, and we are equals. That is what superpower really means here. Not the biggest army anyone ever saw. A state that the Pharaoh of Egypt addressed as an equal, in writing, and could not simply destroy. How many people lived under that empire? We honestly do not know. The best guesses run to a couple of 100,000 or more across the whole territory. But they're guesses. The hard part, the part you can still walk through the ruins of, is the city. And the city says, plainly, this was a great power. And now that we can read them, the archive does something no ruin can do. It lets the empire speak for itself, about its kings, its gods, its wars, its crimes. So before we get to the famous peace and the war that came before it, sit a moment in the city the archive describes. Because the people who built those walls left us their own voices. And the voices are not what you would expect from a Bronze Age fortress. Go back to the very beginning of the empire, around 1650 BC, to the king who built the first version of it. His name was Hattusa, and he called himself the Lion of Hatti. And he did something almost no other Bronze Age ruler did. As he was dying, he dictated a kind of last testament, and we have it, and it is startlingly personal. He had meant to leave the throne to his nephew, but the nephew had failed him, and Hattusa says so on clay, with a bitterness the centuries have not dulled. The young man, he says, showed no compassion. He was cold. When he should have wept, he shed no tears. So the old king disinherits him in writing, and names his grandson instead, and tells the boy to be the kind of man the nephew was not. A dying king, settling his family in clay, naming the relative who let him down. You are not reading a chronicle here, you are reading a person. That same founding dynasty produced one of the most astonishing single feats of the whole Bronze Age. Around 1595 BC, the lion's grandson, a king named Mursili, marched an army roughly 2,000 kilometers south, deeper than any Hittite force had ever gone, all the way to Babylon. And he took it. He ended the dynasty of Hammurabi, the most famous lawgiver in the ancient world, in a single raid. He did not even try to hold it. He looted the great city, burned what he chose, and turned for home. The Hittites, this early, could reach out and topple the most storied kingdom in Mesopotamia, and then simply leave. And then, on the road home, this king who had just conquered Babylon was knifed to death by his own brother-in-law. Which tells you the other thing about this empire, the thing that runs under its whole history like a fault line. The Hittites were extraordinarily dangerous to their enemies, and they were just as dangerous to each other. The throne changed hands again and again by murder. And yet, for all that violence at the top, this was not a cruel empire in the way you might expect. Remember the cliff Texier drew, back at the very start, the one with the gods marching in single file? We can read it now. It is the Hittite pantheon, carved into the living rock, 60-odd gods striding toward a meeting in the center. And a lot of those gods are not Hittite at all. Because the Hittites had a policy, when they conquered you, that was almost the opposite of what empires usually do. They did not stamp out your gods, they adopted them. They added your gods to their own, carried them home, gave them a place in the procession on the cliff. They called their religion the religion of 1,000 gods, and they meant it close to literally, because every people they absorbed brought more. A superpower whose instinct on conquering you was to collect your gods rather than smash them. And it was not all kings and gods and murder either. One of the loveliest things to survive from the empire is a tall clay pot made around 1600 BC, banded from top to bottom with little modelled figures. And the scene on it is a celebration. A sacred marriage with musicians playing, people clapping, dancers moving, someone pouring a drink, the whole thing alive with ordinary human joy. No king, no battle, just people at a feast 3,500 years ago in a culture we had forgotten existed. So this is who signed the treaty in the ash. A people who wrote down their grief and their grudges, who could march 2,000 kilometers and burn Babylon, who murdered their way through their own bloodline, who gathered up the gods of everyone they met, and who, in between all of it, threw a feast and danced. Which brings us at last to the war. Before the war, though, one quick correction, because it goes to the heart of what made this empire strong, and almost everyone gets it wrong. If you have heard anything at all about the Hittites, you have probably heard this: that they ruled by a secret weapon, iron. That while everyone else was still fighting in soft bronze, the Hittites had iron swords, and that this is what made them unstoppable. It is a wonderful story. It is also a myth. The Hittites fought in bronze, like everyone else in the Bronze Age. Iron in their world was not a weapon of war at all. It was rare, precious prestige metal, and a fair amount of it had quite literally fallen from the sky, smelted out of meteorites before anyone could dig it from the earth. And we do not have to guess at this, because the empire left us a letter about it. A Hittite great king writing back to a neighbour who had asked him for iron, and more or less apologizing. "Good iron," he writes, "is not at present available in my storehouse. It is a bad time for producing iron." And then the line that gives the whole game away. "Today I am sending you an iron dagger blade." One dagger. From the richest court in Anatolia to a fellow king, as a gift worth mentioning. These people did not have an iron monopoly. Their power was never a metal. It was reach and walls and chariots and writing. The better story is the true one. Now the war. Around the year 1274 BC, on a river in Syria, beside a city called Kadesh, the Hittite great king Mu'atali met Ramesses II of Egypt in what may have been the largest chariot battle ever fought. Perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 chariots in all, on the two sides together, churning the ground by the river. And those chariots are worth pausing on because they are the real Hittite weapon, the thing the iron myth gets in the way of. A war chariot is a precision machine, and the horses that pull it have to be conditioned like athletes. In the same archive that held the treaty, there is a training manual for exactly that. A day-by-day program, 184 days long, for getting chariot horses into fighting condition. It opens, "Thus speaks Kikuli, master horse trainer." It is the oldest horse training manual in the world, and it sat on a shelf in Hattusa, a few rooms from the record of the largest chariot battle in history. That is how this empire fought. Not with magic metal, with horses and engineering and written down expertise. And Kadesh is special among all the battles of the ancient world for one more reason. It is the only major battle we can hear about from both sides. The Egyptians wrote it down. The Hittites wrote it down. We have both. And both of them say they won. One word of honesty about both sides, because it matters. The surviving record is overwhelmingly Egyptian. Ramesses carved his version of Kadesh across the walls of at least 5 temples, enormous and repetitive and triumphant. The Hittite account is a few lines in the archive, so it is not a fair fight on parchment, but both kings did record it, and both claimed the victory. And that is the strange part.
Look at what Ramesses actually carved.
On wall after wall, he is the hero of Kadesh, single-handed, gigantic, scattering the Hittites into the river. Total victory. The pharaoh as a god in a chariot. But Ramesses, or his scribes, did something strange. In the middle of all that triumph, they preserved the moment it nearly went the other way. Because what actually happened that day was an ambush, and Ramesses walked straight into it. The Hittite king had fed him false intelligence, 2 captured men who swore the Hittite army was far to the north. So Ramesses pushed ahead of his own forces with a single division, set up camp by the city, and only then learned the truth. The entire Hittite army was hidden on the other side of Kadesh, a few kilometers away, and now it came around the city and smashed into his column on the march. His divisions were cut to pieces and scattered, and the king found himself cut off in his chariot, with the enemy all around him and his own army nowhere in sight. And the monument writes down what he said, or what it wants us to believe he said. "No officer was with me," the inscription reads, "no charioteer, no soldier of the army. I call on you, my father Amun. I am amid unknown multitudes. Nations are gathered against me." That is the great victory monument, and buried inside it, in the king's own voice, is a man who thought, for a moment, that he was about to die. The propaganda accidentally preserved the disaster. So what actually happened under the carving? Ramesses recovered. He fought his way out, and at the end of the day, the Egyptian army still stood. By that measure, he was not lying when he said he had not lost. But he did not take the city. He laid no siege he could hold. He turned around and marched home. And the Hittites kept Kadesh, and they kept the territory around it that the whole war had been about. So the most honest reading historians can give is this: Kadesh was a draw, a bloody, enormous draw that left the strategic prize in Hittite hands. Ramesses called it the greatest triumph in Egyptian history and carved it on 5 temples. The Hittites, more quietly, kept the ground. Both kings said they won. The wall that shouts the loudest is the one that lost the argument. And then, about 15 years after the battle, those same 2 empires did something far stranger than fighting. They wrote down a piece, the piece whose Hittite copy Winkler would pull out of the ash 30 centuries later. But the road to that piece runs through a wall the empire's own language had kept standing this whole time. Because we have been talking about what the Hittites said, the treaty, the battle, the king's panic in the chariots. And for years after Winkler dug those tablets out of the ground, not one human being alive could actually read a single word of them. This is the wall the archive left standing. Winkler had proven the Hittites were real. He had not made them speak. The tablets were the empire's own voice, and the voice was in a language that had died 3,000 years before, written in borrowed signs, matching nothing anyone alive had ever seen. They had the words and could not read them. The Hittites had been proven real, and they were still total strangers. Then, during the First World War, a Czech scholar named Bedřich Hrozný sat with one ritual line from the archive and saw something that should not have been there. The line, more or less, said this: "Now you will eat bread and you will drink water." A small, ordinary, domestic sentence. And in it, Hrozný saw two words he recognized. He saw the word for eat sitting exactly where a Latin speaker would put their own word for eat, and he saw the word watar, sitting exactly where you, right now, would put the word water. Watar. Water. This dead Bronze Age language, this empire the experts had erased, was not alien at all. It was a cousin. Hittite turned out to be the oldest written member that we have ever found of the family of languages that includes Latin and Greek and Sanskrit and German and English. The oldest written relative of the words you are listening to right now. When the Hittites said water, they said something a little like we do 3,500 years ago on the far side of a dead empire. Because somewhere far back, before any of it, the words were one word. An empire the experts had rubbed out of history had just been read in its own voice, and the voice, faintly, was ours. And once you could read the one language, the archive opened all the way up, and what it held was stranger than a single dead tongue. Because the Hittites did not write only in Hittite, their archive holds something like 8 different languages, side by side on neighboring shelves. The diplomatic letters in the international language of the day, religious texts in older tongues the priests had preserved, lists, rituals, the languages of peoples the empire had swallowed. A single building on a hill in Anatolia, holding 8 languages at once, 3,000 years before anyone thought to call a place multicultural. The empire that collected gods collected languages too, and kept them, and filed them. So the strangers in the clay turned out to be distant family. And the first thing family does, when you can finally hear them, is talk about themselves. Because that is what the archive really is. Not a list of laws and treaties, a people talking about their weddings, their gods, their quarrels, their dead. And one of the letters in it is one of the most astonishing things any human being ever wrote down. It comes from Egypt. A queen, a pharaoh's widow, has just lost her husband, and she has no son, no heir. And around her the men of her own court are circling. And she writes in desperation to the king of the Hittites, to the enemy. And she says this: "My husband died, a son I have not. But to you, they say, the sons are many. If you would give me one son of yours, he would become my husband. Never shall I take a servant of mine and make him my husband." A widowed queen of Egypt, begging the great king of a rival empire for one of his sons. Because marrying down, marrying one of her own subjects, is more unthinkable to her than marrying her enemy. The king who received that letter was Suppiluliuma, the greatest of the Hittite conquerors, the man who had built the empire to its height. And his reaction is in the archive too, in his own record, and it is wonderfully human. "Such a thing," he says, "has never happened to me in my whole life." He does not believe it. A queen of Egypt asking for a Hittite prince to be her husband and her pharaoh? He thinks it is a trap, a trick to lure one of his sons into enemy hands. So he sends envoys south to check whether she is telling the truth. She is. And she is insulted. She writes back, furious that he doubts her word. "Why," she demands, "would I write about my own and my country's shame to a foreign land if I had a son?" So at last he sends one, a prince named Zananza, riding south to become a pharaoh of Egypt on the strength of a letter. Zananza never arrived. He was murdered somewhere on the road. Who killed him and on whose orders we do not know. But the consequences we do know, and they were enormous. Suppiluliuma, enraged, sent his armies into Egyptian territory in revenge, and his soldiers brought something home from that campaign that no army wants: a plague. A sickness that would burn through the Hittite heartland for the next 20 years and kill among its first victims the great conqueror himself. An alliance offered and refused, a prince dead in a ditch, and an empire poisoned by its own revenge. All of it set in motion by one widow's letter. Now, you may have heard who this queen was. You will read in a lot of places that she was Ankhesenamun, the teenage widow of Tutankhamun, the boy pharaoh. She may have been. It is the leading guess, and it is a haunting one. But the truth is stranger. The word the Hittites wrote down for her, Dakamunzu, was probably not a name at all. Scholars think it is the Egyptian phrase for the king's wife, a title. So we have her exact words. We have her desperation, her pride, her refusal, set down 3,500 years ago. And we are not entirely sure who she was. That is the wonder of this archive in a single letter. Not that we can barely see these people, that we can see them this clearly and still not know their names. Now follow that plague forward. It killed the great conqueror, Suppiluliuma. It killed his eldest son and heir within a year, and it kept killing, season after season, through the reign that followed, for something like 20 years. To the Hittites, who saw the world as a contract between people and gods, a plague that would not lift could only mean one thing: someone had sinned, and the gods had not been paid. And so the conqueror's youngest son, who had come to the throne almost by accident, sat in the palace surrounded by death and tried to work out the debt. His name was Mursili, and what he did next is one of the strangest documents any ruler has ever left behind. He reasoned it out, on clay, like a man building a legal case against his own family. If the gods are angry, then a crime is unpaid. So he goes back through the records looking for the sin. And he finds it. He finds that his own father, the great Suppiluliuma, had taken the throne in the first place by having the rightful heir, a man named Tudhalia, murdered. The whole dynasty, his own crown, rested on a killing. And so the king of the Hittites, in a prayer copied out and kept in the royal archive, confesses his dead father's murder, out loud, in writing, to a god to explain a plague. "You gods have taken vengeance on my father," he writes, "for this affair of Tudhalia. My father died because of the blood of Tudhalia. And then Mursili has now confessed the sin of his father." Think about the nerve and the strangeness of that. A reigning king publicly admitting that his own family's claim to the throne was built on a murder, reasoning his way from an epidemic to inherited guilt like a lawyer, and then filing the confession away in the state archive for us to find. And he was not even the first Hittite king to worry about this. Generations earlier, after a long run of royal murders, an earlier king had sat down and written a law about it. A law about how the royal family was to behave. And the heart of that law is so blunt it is almost funny. "Do not kill anyone among the royal family," it reads. "That is not good." Most empires bury their crimes. This one filed them. Which brings us back to the peace, the treaty in the ash. Because there is one detail about that peace that almost everyone gets backwards, and it unlocks the whole thing. The Hittite king who made peace with Ramesses was not the king Ramesses had fought at Kadesh. That king was dead. The man who signed the famous peace was his brother, Hattusili, who had taken the throne by pushing his own nephew off it. He was a usurper. And a usurper needs one thing more than anything else. He needs to be recognized. He needs the other great kings to treat him as the rightful king of Hatti, so that no one at home can call him a thief. The peace with Egypt bought him exactly that. The mightiest state in the world signing a treaty with him as an equal, as a brother. The peace was not only an end to war, it was Hattusili's legitimacy, carved in silver. But the figure I want to leave you with from this court is not the usurper. It is his wife. Her name was Puduhepa, and she may have been the most powerful woman of the entire Late Bronze Age. Part of that was the office itself. The Hittite queen, the Tawanana, was not just the king's wife. It was a position with real power that a woman held for her whole life, even after her husband the king was dead. A widowed queen could outrank the next king's own wife for years. So Hittite queens were not ornaments. They were institutions. And Puduhepa filled the office to its edges. She had her own royal seal stamped on documents of state. She sat in judgment on legal cases in her own right. She reorganized the empire's religion, and she wrote directly to Ramesses II of Egypt, not through her husband, to him, head of state to head of state. When the peace between Hatti and Egypt was sealed, as these things were with a royal wedding, her own daughter sent south to marry Ramesses, it was Puduhepa who ran the negotiation. And she made the most powerful man on earth wait. Years. While she assembled the dowry on her own terms, in her own time, until it was done to her satisfaction. The Pharaoh of Egypt, the living god of the Nile, kept waiting on a Hittite queen's schedule. We have her voice, too, in the archive, plain and proud. "I produced sons and daughters," she wrote of herself, "so that the people of Hatti often speak of my experience and capacity for nurture." This was the empire at its absolute height, co-equal with Egypt, a queen who could keep a pharaoh waiting, a peace carved in silver and sworn before 1,000 gods. And within about 70 years of that peace, the capital would be empty, not burned by an enemy, not stormed in the night. Empty. Around the year 1200 BC, the capital that Texier would one day stumble into, the great fortress city of Hattusa, burned. And the easy version of what happened next is the one the documentaries love: barbarians. The sea peoples, a wave of raiders out of the chaos of the age, sweeping in and storming the citadel and ending the empire in a single night of fire. It is dramatic, it is simple, and the dirt does not support it. Because when the archaeologists looked carefully at what the fire actually burned, they found something that does not fit a sack at all. The valuables were gone. The archives, the tens of thousands of tablets that held the empire's entire memory, the most important of them, had been carried out before the fire. The treasure, the records, the things a raider comes for and a fleeing court takes with it, all removed, in order, ahead of time. The Hittites were not overrun in their capital. They saw the end coming, and they emptied it. They packed up their own city and walked away, and the fire came afterward into a place that was already a shell. Who lit it, we honestly do not know. Raiders from the north, who had harried this frontier for centuries, a last internal collapse, an accident in an abandoned town. The evidence does not say. But the headline is the quiet one, and it is far stranger than any sack. A superpower organized its own departure, carried out its own history, and left its capital standing empty to burn behind it. And it leaves you with a question the dirt cannot answer. Why would they do that? You do not pack up your own capital, the fortress your ancestors built over 400 years, the seat of your gods, unless you have decided there is no longer any point in defending it. You leave a city like that only when staying has become more dangerous than going. We do not know where they went. We know only that the last great king to rule from Hattusa simply stops appearing in the record, and after him the proud fortress in the hills is left to the wind. They did not lose their city, they walked out of it, and that is somehow harder to look at than a sack. There is one more piece, and it is recent, and it has to be handled with care. Far to the west of Hattusa, scientists read the growth rings of ancient juniper trees, and the rings recorded 3 terrible years in a row, 3 failed harvests right at the end. Around 1198, 1197, and 1196 BC. 3 years of drought, and then the empire goes quiet. It is tempting to say, there it is, that is what killed them. But that is not what the science says, and it is not what happened. The drought was real, it was severe, and on its own, it was not enough. It struck a world that was already coming apart, trade routes failing, grain shipments drying up, one great power after another going down across the whole eastern Mediterranean in the same few decades. The drought was a hard shove against a structure that was already leaning, not the cause, a trigger at the end of a long unravelling. We even have a letter from the very edge of it, a king of a coastal city named Ugarit, writing as raiders close on his shore, explaining almost helplessly why he cannot defend himself. His forces are not there. All my troops and chariots, he writes, are in the land of Hatti. He had sent his army off to help hold up the Hittite Empire, and now the empire could not help him, and the enemy was at his own gates. The great powers were going down together, each one propping up the next until none of them could stand. So the question this whole story has been carrying, how do you lose an empire this completely, finally has an answer. And the answer is gentler and grimmer than a sack. You do not lose it in a single night of fire. The people leave, the records go quiet, the capital stands empty, and then it burns, and then 3,000 years of wind and rain do the rest. The Hittites did not fall exactly. They walked off the page of history, and almost no one wrote down where they went. And yet the name did not die at the gates of Hattusa. When the capital emptied, the empire's heart stopped, but its edges kept beating. Down in the south, along the upper Euphrates and across northern Syria, smaller kingdoms had grown up under the empire's shadow, ruled in some cases by branches of the old royal house. Cities like Carchemish, like Malatya. And when the centre fell silent, those southern kingdoms did not. They carried the name forward. For roughly 500 years after Hattusa was abandoned, there were still kings in Syria who called themselves Hittite. They still cut their words into stone in the old script. One of them, a ruler of Carchemish named Kusi-Teshub, a descendant of the very dynasty that had once ruled from the great fortress in the hills, still styled himself by the old imperial title, Great King. The empire was gone. The name walked south and lived another 5 centuries in its children. And here, at last, we can come back to the question the very beginning of this story set aside. Remember the footnote, the Hittites of the Bible, Abraham buying his field from the children of Heth, Uriah the Hittite sent to die. The line everyone read straight past. These southern kingdoms, the ones that kept the name alive for 500 years after the empire fell, are the most plausible bridge between the two. They were still there, still called Hittite, still trading and warring across the lands the scriptures describe, in exactly the centuries the Bible's writers were looking at the world. Now, this has to be said carefully, because it is the kind of place a story wants to run ahead of its evidence. The connection is not proven. Scholars genuinely disagree about whether the Bible's children of Heth are the heirs of the empire at all, or a small local people who happen to share a name. The honest answer is that we do not know. But the most likely path, the bridge that best fits what we can actually trace, runs through these surviving southern kingdoms. The empire under the burned hill ended around 1180 BC. The name it carried did not. It survived, in its children, long enough to reach the one book that would carry it across the next 3,000 years, all the way down to the missionary with the bucket of plaster who would go looking for the people behind it. The name was not the only thing that outlived them. So did the peace they had made. Go back to that treaty for a moment, the one Winkler pulled from the ash, the one whose halves matched across 1,000 miles. Read what is actually in it, and it stops sounding ancient at all. It is not just a promise to stop fighting. The two kings promise to defend each other. If one is attacked, the other will come to his aid. They promise to support each other's chosen heirs, so that a disputed succession in one kingdom does not become a war between both. And there is a clause that could have been written in the last century. The two kingdoms agree that if someone important flees from the one country into the other, the country they flee to will hand them back. an extradition treaty running in both directions 3,250 years ago. If any great man flees from the land of Egypt, it reads, and comes to the lands of the great chief of Hatti, the great chief of Hatti shall cause them to be brought back to the great ruler of Egypt. And then, in the same breath, a touch of mercy that is easy to miss. When those people are sent home, the treaty asks, they are not to be punished for having fled. The men are returned, but the returning is not to be made into a cruelty. Mutual defense, recognized succession, extradition, softened by mercy. Two great powers, in the Bronze Age, building the machinery of a lasting peace the way we would build it now, and sealing it not with a single signature, but by swearing it before 1,000 gods on both sides. And so today, there hangs a copper replica of that treaty on a wall at the headquarters of the United Nations in New York, a few steps from the chamber where the Security Council meets. The oldest surviving peace treaty between two great powers, displayed where the world still tries to do the same thing. The empire that wrote it was gone within a lifetime of its golden age. The peace is still on the wall. And the empire itself had to be dug back out of the ground.
The Hittites were never really lost. That is the thing to carry away from all of this. Their capital sat in the open Anatolian hills for 70 years, drawn and printed in a book. The Bible named their people. An Egyptian temple wall recorded their greatest war in detail the whole time. The world held every single piece, and it could not read one of them. What was missing was never the evidence. It was someone who could read it. A missionary with a bucket of plaster. A German with a shovel in the right hill. A Czech who looked at eat and water in a dead ritual line and heard his own tongue. A forgotten empire, it turns out, is not a lost one. It is an empire still sitting there, in the open, in its own words, waiting for someone who can finally understand them. We brought them all the way back. We learned to read their treaties and their laws and their letters home. We can hear a queen begging her enemy for a husband, and a king confessing his father's murder to a god, and a great power calling a great power brother. And the last thing we learned to see, reading their own final tablets, was the empire packing up its capital in good order, carrying its history out through the gates and leaving the city behind it to the fire and the silence and the weather. They walked away, and the hill kept their words in the dark for 3,000 years, until we came back and dug and learned to listen.